titled What Lies Ahead for the International Seabed Authority in 2025, the negotiations of the mining code amidst growing calls for a pause or moratorium on deep seabed mining in the area. This event is co-hosted by the IUCN Secretariat, together with two of its commission, the World Commission on Environmental Law, WCL, and the Commission on Ecosystem Management, CEM, alongside the Dona Bertarelli Philanthropy and the Oceano Azul Foundation. This event is convened on a Monday morning in Europe, which allows colleagues from the Asia-Pacific region to join in, and we will make the recording available for colleagues for which the time is not very friendly. Just to mention that this week there will be another webinar to touch upon the legal aspects of deep sea mining, which is being convened by Pure and Resolve on March 12th in the afternoon in Europe time, entitled Heading for a Dispute, Examining Possible Legal Claims from the ISA's First Mining Decision. And we will paste in the chat the registration link right after this. I'm going to do it straight away, actually. So here is the registration link for those of you who are interested. So 2025 will be an important year for deep seabed mining. Why so? First of all, the deep sea mining negotiations are about to resume with the ISA consoles to resume on March 17th, so next Monday, under the helm of the new Madam Secretary General, Leticia Carvalho. Then we also have all indications that the metals company are planning to submit an exploitation application in June 2025. There's also a growing wave of voices speaking against the possible start of deep seabed mining activities. We have 32 countries that have officially voiced their position for a pause, moratorium, or a ban. We also have financial institutions, marine science and policy experts, and also the special rapporteurs on the rights for a clean, healthy, and sustainable environments, to name a few that have voiced against deep sea mining activities to start. And finally, there's also the developing governance framework for the ocean and biodiversity protection, which is evolving, and with the recent adoption of the BBJ agreement, and also the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So against this backdrop, today's webinar will discuss the current state of play in the ongoing negotiations, and also dive deeper into the concept of pause or moratorium for deep seabed mining in the area. So to do so, this webinar will first take stock on deep seabed mining negotiations, which are set to resume next week, before turning to the key finding of a recent paper entitled A Pause or Moratorium for Deep Seabed Mining in the Area, the Legal Basis, Potential Pathways, and Possible Policy Implications. This paper focuses on what it means to implement a precautionary pause or a moratorium on deep seabed mining. And so to do so, we have three distinguished experts which have co-authored this paper, namely Pradeep Singh, who's a senior project manager for international advocacy at the Oceano Azul Foundation, but he's also a lead of the Deep Seabed Mining Thematic Group of the IUCN Commission on Ecosystem Management, and also a deputy chair of the Ocean Law Specialist Group of the other commission, WCL. We then have Aline Yakel, who's an associate professor at the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resource and Security, ANCORS, at the University of Wollongong, Australia. And last but not least, we have Jeff Ardron, Africa's Oceans Director for the Nature's Conservancy based in Mombasa, Kenya. So we, of course, encourage you to leave comments and questions in the comment section on the Q&A box. And without further ado, I'll pass on the floor to Pradeep, who will present us an overview of the state of play of deep seabed mining negotiations. Pradeep, all yours.
Thank you very much, Clement, and good day to everyone. Let me share my screen first. And please let me know if you can see it once it's in full screen, which should be around about now.
Yes, correct. Good.
Great. Okay, so I'll be talking about the state of play of negotiations currently at the ISA. And first of all, thank you for the organizers for hosting this event today, especially the IUCN Secretariat and all sponsors. So state of affairs, last year in 2024, the International Seabed Authority turned 30 since its inception in 1994. As of now, we have exploration regulations in place. These have been adopted for 3 resource types. So for nodules, that was adopted in the year 2000 and revised in 2013. We have exploration regulations also for sulfides adopted in 2010 and for crusts in 2012. So exploration activities have been ongoing. We have 30 contracts in existence, and it will soon be 31 because a new plan of work has just been approved by the council. And the chart here kind of shows where these activities, exploration activities, are taking place. So 19 contracts for nodules, 7 for sulfides, and 4 for crusts. I think a key point to note is that there are no exploitation activities as of yet, so just exploration activities. And the ISA is currently negotiating what is called a mining code, which will include rules, regulations, and procedures, or RRPs, for exploitation. Now, how does this process take place? So as was the case for exploration activities, it's also the same for exploitation activities. So regulations will first be prepared, a draft of it by the Legal and Technical Commission, which is a subsidiary body of the council, and then this draft will be presented to the council. Now, it's the council that negotiates the text, goes through them line by line, and if some point, if it's ready for adoption, the council will adopt the regulations, and the council can also decide to provisionally apply them pending the approval of the assembly. Now, I think a very important point to note here is that the RRPs, the regulations, must be adopted by consensus at the council. And the council is this body comprising 36 states. What this means that if one of these 36 states actually make a formal objection to the adoption of the regulations, they cannot be adopted. States would still have to find a compromise and continue the negotiations. As long as one of the 36 states object to the adoption, the regulations cannot be adopted, and I'll come back to that later. Once adopted by the council, it goes to the assembly for approval. The assembly, which is the plenary body of the ISA, so all states are represented, and at the moment we have 169 member states and the EU that comprise or constitute the assembly. The assembly doesn't have any explicit power to reject the regulations, but they can provide comments and return it back to the council for further consideration. And if the assembly does this, the council has to consider the views of the assembly, make the necessary revisions, and resubmit it to the assembly. But again, I think it's important to remember that during this whole process, the council can already still decide to provisionally apply the regulations pending the approval of the assembly. Now, the fact that the regulations must be adopted by consensus, that was something that actually caused an issue after the adoption of the Convention UNCLOS, the Convention on the Law of the Sea in 1982, that led to further negotiations and the insertion of what is called the 2-year rule. That was inserted in the 1994 agreement that is to be read together with the convention, and it provides a provision in section 1, paragraph 15, that any member state may give a notice to the ISA Council of the intention for an application to be submitted for exploitation. And if such notice is given, there is a prescribed time of 2 years for the Council to finalize and adopt the regulations. Now, if the council does not, is unable to finalize the regulations, an application can be submitted for consideration in the absence of regulations. And so the intention of this provision was inserted, bearing in mind this possibility of one or a very small number of states blocking the adoption of the regulations, which, as I said earlier, must be adopted by consensus at the council. So this 2-year rule provision was invoked by Nauru in mid-2021, and that prescribed time expired on the 9th of July, 2023. So that's just background. I wanted to give you an overview of what's actually been happening. So somewhere around 2014, 2015, the Legal and Technical Commission and the Secretariat commenced work on the draft exploitation regulation. This process took a number of years, actually about 5 years, before an advanced draft was presented to the Council. Meanwhile, in 2018, the Council created a working group specifically on the financial terms, how much contractors would have to pay to the ISA in terms of royalties. In 2019, the Council received the advanced draft from the Commission and then established 3 working groups, one on the environment, one on institutional matters, and one on inspection, compliance, and enforcement. As you would recall, mentioned earlier, there is this other working group that was already in existence on financial terms. And then it was decided that everything else would fall under who's presiding over the Council. In 2020, in February, there was a meeting of the Council where the negotiations were taken ahead through the working groups. But right after that February 2020 meeting, I'm sure we would all remember, even though it feels like a long time ago, came COVID-19, which meant that the ISA could no longer convene. Now, in 2021, in June, while the ISA was still not able to convene due to the pandemic, this provision was invoked by Nauru, the 2-year rule provision. In 2022, Council resumed negotiations. There were 3 meetings that year. And interestingly, Council convened what is called an informal intersessional dialogue to discuss the 2-year rule in November 2022. And I'll come back to that shortly. In 2023, negotiations still resumed in the format of the informal working groups, and there were 3 meetings that year. And the informal intersessional dialogue also continued with with the discussions on the 2-year rule. In 2024, this was when the Council started negotiating based on what is called a consolidated text. So no longer in the informal working groups, but one consolidated text containing all the regulations that was held under or was convened under the precedent. And we only had 2 meetings last year, so no 3rd meeting. Now, I mentioned the informal intersessional dialogue. I think it's important to give you some context about it because this is very relevant to the discussion today. It was convened by a decision of the Council in November 2022. The dialogue itself was co-facilitated by Belgium and Singapore, provided an opportunity for an exchange of views among member states and observers on the 2-year rule. And it completed its terms of reference in July 2023. Now, it sort of narrowed down questions on the 2-year rule and summarized where the divergences in views were. The first, I think, important point was whether an application can be disapproved or it can be rejected. And there seemed to be broad agreement that an application can be rejected. Just because one is submitted doesn't mean that it would automatically be approved and mining can start. The second, I think, conclusion that came out of this dialogue was what would be the decision-making process if an application is made. So what's the criteria for evaluation? What is the role of the Commission? And what would the voting rules at the Council be, since the 2-year rule is silent on this? And here, there was no consensus, but the dialogue managed to summarize some of the key points of divergences. And I think finally, the other topic that was discussed is, because the 2-year rule says that an application can be provisionally approved, what does provisional approval actually mean? And here the dialogue was able to also sort of come to the conclusion that it seems obvious that it's not a full and final approval, but there's no clarity as to what is meant by this provisional approval. So very important, because that led to the important meeting of the Council in July 2023. As I mentioned, the deadline expired on the 9th of July. Coincidentally, the Council was already scheduled to meet at the very next day, from the 10th to the 21st of July in 2023. And the Council adopted 2 decisions, important decisions on the last day of that meeting. The first was on a timeline following the expiration of the prescribed time of 2 years. Here, the Council decided that commercial exploitation should not commence in the absence of regulations. So basically, mining should not start until a regulatory framework has been agreed upon and adopted and is in place. And then went on to decide that the Council intends to continue the elaboration of regulations relating to exploitation with a view to their adoption in the 30th session, which is this year. Now, the second decision was based on the intersessional dialogue that I just mentioned, on an understanding on the application of the 2-year rule. Again, Council reiterated that commercial exploitation should not commence in the absence of regulations, and then further agreed to discuss further actions to take as a matter of priority if an application happens to be submitted while the regulations are absent. So essentially decided to not continue the discussions under the dialogue, but to pick up this 2-year rule situation if and when an application is submitted. Now, last year, what has happened, and I think this is very important when we sort of talk about what to expect for this year. So the Council last had their meeting from the 15th to the 26th of July last year. It was decided not to have a third meeting last year, but there was productive intersessional work that took place since the last meeting leading up to the next meeting, which is next week. Negotiations were based as part of that consolidated text, that one text that I mentioned earlier. And it has been said that the first reading has been completed, so 107 regulations have been read through. But I think important to note that in that so-called first reading, many textual proposals were not actually included in that version. And so they were, it was a missed opportunity to consider those textual proposals. Also, 107 regulations were read, but annexes and schedules, which are also part of the consolidated text, were not discussed. So I would still say a substantial amount of the so-called first reading is incomplete because the main regulations actually refer to the annexes and to the schedules quite extensively. And I think finally, the regulations also refer to standards and guidelines. There are more than 50 of such standards and guidelines, 50, that have been anticipated within the regulations. They are not part of the consolidated text, but states have agreed that they should be negotiated together. And this has also not been discussed. So what comes next, 2025? Council is scheduled to meet in March and in July this year. So far, only 2 meetings are anticipated. Of course, it's up to member states to decide whether they want to meet more, but tentatively 2 meetings have been scheduled and budgeted for. The Secretariat and the President of the Council has already issued a revised version of the draft consolidated text and a suspense document. Essentially, all the items that have been sort of moved out of the regulations are currently in the suspense documents for states to decide what to do with them. And from my initial preliminary analysis, there are still many fundamental issues, outstanding matters, gaps in text that remain unresolved. And it also seems that in this case as well, quite a few textual proposals were not included. And so this coming meetings will be very interesting. For what lies ahead, I'll be happy to share the slides so you can look at the webpage of the ISA that is dedicated to the 30th session, or part 1, which is the March meeting of the Council. So you can find the provisional agenda and the indicative program of work, how the meeting is going to be conducted. 10 days of meeting. Out of the 10 days, 7.5 days have been allocated for negotiations on the regulations. And there's also going to be a high-level discussion on how to tackle the standards and guidelines. I wanted to end quickly by pointing out that there has been a request by Nauru, which invoked the 2-year rule provision in 2021, to actually insert a new agenda item in the provisional agenda. It's tentatively under item 12, with the title Process for the Consideration of Applications for Plans of Work for Exploitation in the Absence of Adopted Regulations. And I think very recently, and I was just going through the website on Sunday, and I saw a request, a letter from Chile requesting to amend this agenda item to further considerations of actions that the Council may take if an application were to be submitted before the regulations have been completed. And so this language seems to track the decision that was taken in July 2023. So it'd be interesting to see how this agenda item is taken up. So outlook, what to expect in 2025. One aspect is whether states would discuss this process that would apply for mining to take place in the absence of regulations. I think we should also expect a genuine attempt to take a stock take of progress that has been made so far. And I think also, given that many outstanding matters still remain that require resolution, we could also expect a new discussion on a new roadmap or a timeline on how to progress forward. So with that, I think negotiations are ongoing. I think one very interesting development is that the one mining company that is eager to go ahead has already announced that they will be submitting an application at the end of June this year. And this was also sort of reiterated in the request by Nauru for a new agenda item, that an application is coming in at the end of June in the absence of regulations. And as we sort of have been hearing, and also it's the subject of the discussion today, calls for a moratorium are going or growing, not just from scientists and experts or industry, but also from the IUCN, which adopted Resolution 122 in September 2021. And more governments are sort of taking a position calling for a precautionary pause or a moratorium on deep seabed mining, which actually led me and my two amazing colleagues that are on the call today, Alina Yekel and Jeff Ardron, to actually write this paper to share our understanding of these calls for a pause or a moratorium. You can see the QR code there that you should be able to scan and get access to the paper. Just wanted to, again, record my appreciation to those that supported us in this paper, particularly to IUCN and Dona Bertarelli, Philanthropy, who actually agreed after the paper was accepted to help us with the open access fee. So thank you very much. Over to you, Clement.
Thank you very much, Pradeep, for walking us through the recent developments and the outlook and briefly presenting this paper. I think it's a nice segue into the second part of this webinar, which will be a quick panel with the authors to discuss some of the key findings from that very paper that Pradeep was presenting on the screen. So we have a quick panel that we decided to put together, and we will try and approach the various segments of the paper to have an overview from the authors. First, we will look into the policy implications of the moratorium, the precautionary pause. Then we looked more into the legal basis of those concepts. So what do they mean and so on, before looking into past example and potential pathways. And as we go through those various sections, we encourage you once again to drop your comments, questions in either the chat or the Q&A box that you can find in the features of this Zoom call. So diving straight in, first, let's look into the possible policy implications that are outlined in the paper. And I think it is clear that with this call for moratorium precautionary pause, there are a number of reasons that are invoked by those that are calling for those. And so there is a nice table in the paper that kind of outlines the various reasons underpinning these calls. And so I was wondering if one of the authors could go through some of those reasons, and we prepared a quick table summarizing those to help. And so as I'm sharing my screen, I will pass the floor on to either Jeff, Pradeep, or Aline. The floor is yours. Let me share my screen.
Thanks, Clement.
I think it should be showing any minute. Yes. Does it work now?
Yep, it's working.
Perfect.
If it's okay with the co-authors, because I was going to go into some of the other questions later. Is that okay, Pradeep and Alina? Well, I'll just go through these reasons. So I think it's important to know that the reasons provided both by the state parties and the non-state observers to the ISA have varied. There's a variety of reasons and a variety of concerns about proceeding with deep seabed mining at this time. And we will later on in this discussion talk about the different kinds of moratorium, because there's not even agreement on the kinds of a moratorium. But let's just say for now, some sort of non-use measure, that there have been a number of reasons put forward. Probably the largest reason put forward by the NGO community has been this idea of a not enough understanding of what the impacts of deep seabed mining might be. And in fact, there's a scientific petition that's been signed by over 900 scientists. And for all disclosure, I am one of the signatories to it that talks about this lack of knowledge, and that scientists would like to see a little bit more knowledge before we proceed. So that is probably the number one reason, but there are a number of others that are linked to this, like the availability of the data. Data are not all being shared. We don't understand the economics of the situation. There's a lot of questions around the technology that's being proposed to be used. Then there's regulatory gaps. Pradeep really covered those, but just to say that the so-called mining code is not finished, and in my personal opinion, not near being finished. And likewise, it doesn't seem that the institutional structures are yet ready to go. Mainly, there's some sort of enforcement mechanism within, or some semi-autonomous from the ISA. There have been ongoing concerns around transparency and accountability of the ISA itself, and then whether these problems or issues would be transferred as well to the monitoring, control, and surveillance enforcement mechanism, whatever that is. And up to now, there has been limited public engagement. There's been good opportunity, I would say, for states to participate. But I think we're at a point of history now where we recognize that states do not always represent the full breadth of opinion and perspectives and points of view. And there's an understanding in international law now that other peoples, indigenous peoples, local communities, and others have perspectives which may not be represented by the state. And we haven't seen to date a lot of non-state participation. There's a whole process to become an observer at the ISA. There was at one time a proposal put forward by the former Secretary General to actually tighten up the criteria for what an observer, what would qualify as being an observer. And so there's a separate paper that actually I worked on with some other co-authors, Hannah, Lily, and Alina on this call, that speaks about this limited public engagement to date. And this is what I'm going to cover a little bit later, like in 5 minutes, 3 minutes, about what would happen if we didn't mine, and what would happen if we did mine, and the unintended policy and physical consequences of this. So, gee, imagine a world where we mine today versus imagine a world where we mine maybe at some later date or never at all. And how would that affect marketplaces? So that's the other issue. And mainly it's coming again from the environmentally concerned non-state parties, generally, who are saying, if we didn't mine, would that maybe encourage circular economy, more recycling, and things like that? So those are the issues. And I guess it's worth noting that no one of these that there's a number of things to be considered here. And I wonder out loud, what would happen if some of these got addressed, but others were still outstanding? Would some parties drop off the moratorium, or would they still stay? Or what would be the breaking point? What would be the critical point where how many of these would need to be addressed before maybe people started to say, okay, we no longer need some non-use measure. It's just a question out there to the group. But to say that it's a rather ragtag consortium, consolidation of people agreeing that now is not the time to plow ahead, but they have a variety of reasons. They're not united under their reasons. Okay, I think I'm done with that table.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff, for the overview of some of the recurring reasons, but also some less heard but equally important. So thanks for providing an overview. I don't know if either Aline or Pradeep want to mention something. Otherwise, we can dive straight into the next questions, which Jeff, you already prompted. So this is great. So looking at the authors, I think we dive straight in. So yes, you mentioned the long-term implications and maybe a future-looking exercise of what would be possible consequences of legal interventions and policy decisions. So I don't know if you could provide some of the key findings that you outline in your paper nicely. So yes, if you could touch upon this, Jeff, that'd be much appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, Clément. Thank you for, the screen stopped. So we talk about unintended policy consequences. So an unintended consequence means that you do one thing expecting one result and something else happens instead. And this is very, very common in the policy world. The whole policy literature is littered with unintended consequences. Perhaps the most pertinent unintended consequence is the actual invocation of the 2-year rule itself. I think when the metals company and Nauru together triggered this 2-year rule, they expected that it would speed up the ISA's development of regulations and that they'd be able to mine sooner. But what I don't think they expected was the incredible pushback that came. And now we have a growing number of countries and industry businesses that are saying, hold on, that's too quick. And so in other words, this whole discussion of the moratorium that we're having today, I put it to you, is a result of Nauru and the metals company triggering the 2-year rule. I don't think we'd be here today if they hadn't done that. And that is a perfect example of an unintended consequence. I really don't think the metals company wants a serious discussion about a moratorium. And yet that's what is now on the floor. Up until the 2-year rule was invoked, very few people were talking about a moratorium. Rather famously, Peter Thompson raised it in a meeting. But, except for Peter, it was really a pretty fringe issue. And it really wasn't getting traction until the 2-year rule was triggered. So I think it's worth considering that. For every action, there is a reaction, and those reactions are not necessarily predictable. And I don't pretend to know the answers either. However, and I also would like to add a disclaimer that everything I say here is just my personal opinion. I am probably going to go off-piste from the paper, and I'll probably be saying things my authors might not even agree with. And I can assure you that my former employer, when I was writing this paper, or my current employer, have not been vetted. So this is entirely my personal opinion. So that caveat, please. Markets respond. We saw this when China withheld rare earth elements at one point about 10 years ago. Other rare earth mines opened up. Prices went up, prices went down. So markets respond. For every action, there's a reaction. If the price of cobalt, were to go down because of deep sea mining, then that might encourage cobalt-based technology, battery technologies. On the other hand, if the only cobalt available is at a cheap price, is the cobalt coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there are serious human rights issues, then private industry, private players will probably continue to look at alternatives. And I should point out that the only reason why Congo is the main exporter of cobalt is because they produce it at high environmental costs, high human costs, which means cheap market price. So it's only because they can undercut anyone else who wants to mine it ethically and mine it sustainably. So that is why DR Congo controls the market. It's not because they're the only ones with cobalt. There are other sources of cobalt in the world, just not other cheap sources. So that so we'll see what happens, but if deep sea mining were to occur, then cobalt technologies might start to swing back. But right now we're seeing a swing away from cobalt battery technology. About 1/3 of the electric vehicles in China now, which is quite ahead of the curve in electric vehicles, are cobalt free. And there's also very low cobalt battery technologies being developed, including by Tesla and others. So there's a move away from cobalt because of the serious human rights concerns of the main global source right now. And what that means is that if that continues, that by the time deep sea mining might be ready, and I'm saying in this generation, and that's a big, big if, the markets might have already moved to something else. And we might have already found a better battery. In which case, mining no longer makes financial sense, my friends. Because yes, there are other metals in those nodules. There's a bit of nickel and this and that, but we have lots of nickel coming on the market right now, mainly from Indonesia. So if you look at the metal prices for nickel, it's actually gone down. And likewise, cobalt has not spiked. Cobalt has been actually in a slightly downward trend recently. So if the markets dictate, it might not be economical by the time all these regulations and everything are ready. Another thing that's quite likely, though, is that we would see those companies that are keen to mine, maybe because their shareholders have invested and they need to see a return sooner than later, will be pushing to move from areas beyond national jurisdiction to within national jurisdiction. Now, I want to make clear, yes, there are some places in the world where you can mine in national waters, but there's not many. It's a very small proportion of the total minerals available. In terms of nodules, it's probably mainly the Cook Islands that has been getting together its regulations. In terms of sulfides, we had Papua New Guinea that was looking at moving with a Salwara project, but that's been, for all intents and purposes, on quite hold for a long time after Nautilus went bankrupt. So if mining moved to national jurisdiction, what would that do? Well, first of all, as I said, it's a small, small proportion of the global metals, so it would not affect global metal prices. It would not do that. These are very small areas from a global perspective. What it might do is test the viability of deep seabed mining of different types. Might see if it's economically viable. It might allow us to see what the environmental impacts are in these particular places at the very least, without committing the international community to a much bigger thing. So it could actually be sort of seen as test. And, it could go either way. I'm not convinced, and neither are the big mining companies convinced that this is going to be economically viable. I mean, it's worth noting that none of the mining majors are currently invested in deep seabed mining. If the mining majors were actually concerned that we were running out on land and that they were going to be undercut by deep sea mining, they would invest. The Rio Tintos of the world and so forth, they'd be there, they'd be investing. And they haven't. They're not investing in deep seabed mining, which tells me that people who've spent their entire careers looking at the metals and minerals markets, they're not convinced. So, we've seen companies go bankrupt like Nautilus. It's not inconceivable that we're going to watch another one go bankrupt. So, we'll see. What else? Oh, the last thing I wanted to touch on is something that I don't think gets enough attention, and probably not even in our paper, so I'm way off piste. Apologies to my authors. This common heritage of humankind question. It is a real concept. ITLOS is the International Tribunal for Law of the Sea, and its judges have recognized it as a real concept. It is not the same thing, though it incorporates the common concern of humankind. Yes, it's the common concern, but common concern is locked in the present, right? Common concern is now, right? Yes, it is about a common property resource, but if they admit this is a common property resource, or if this is a common concern of humankind, the drafters of the Law of the Sea would have said that. Those terms were already available at that time, and in fact, they're built into other agreements like the Intellectual Properties Treaty or the Space Treaty, say common concern of mankind, they say, using the language of the day, but humankind. But they didn't. They said common heritage, patrimony. Heritage is something that continues over time. It is not talking about today. It is talking about something that is meant to continue indefinitely into the future. It is not suggesting, and I really want to underline this, it is not suggesting that these minerals are all ours to gobble up in one generation. Because one generation is not heritage. And so when people say to me, oh, Jeff, you're saving the planet for your children. And I'm saying, for my children? Are you kidding me? My children are doing great. In fact, my daughter makes more money than I do. Like, are you kidding me? I'm not doing this for my children. I'm doing this for my children's 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 children. Because, if we have a little bit of luck behind us, our progeny are going to be with us 200 years from now. And if they are, I really want them to have a few minerals left on this planet. And 200 years from now, guess what? We will have figured out how to take those minerals more sustainably, more quietly, less disruptively. Maybe using little AI robots, picking them up like little cherries off the seafloor. And our science will have progressed immeasurably. Just think about where we were 200 years ago in science. And so a moratorium is not forever. A moratorium is just for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, for touching upon a broad spectrum of implications from what happens at the ISA, the technology, the industry players, and also touching upon the very important concept of common heritage of humankind. So thank you very much for this. I think it's a nice segue to the legal basis that go behind the concept of those non-use measures, whether moratorium or pause, which is one of the questions in the chat. So it's very timely because now we're turning into the legal basis of it. And so within the paper, there is a nice mapping of the various concepts of non-use measures, the very common ones being a moratorium and precautionary pause. And so I'd like to turn to the authors and basically if one of you could tell us a few sentences about these findings, those different types of measures, and what are the legal basis for it. So maybe I can call upon Aline, whilst I share the table 3, which is a nice overview of those various concepts. So Aline, the floor is yours.
Sure, thank you. Yes, so on this question of whether there is a legal basis for a moratorium or precautionary pause and so on, the short answer is yes, there is a legal basis. The long answer is a lot more nuanced than that, and that's probably best given with the use of the table that you just put up there. Thank you for that. So what we do in the paper is to identify 6 different types of so-called non-use measures. And so to talk through individually, what their legal basis would be. And that's important because states aren't necessarily always clear on exactly what type of moratorium they're referring to. So we wanted to give a bit of thought as to what the differences are between the different non-use measures. So the first 2 are quite straightforward, really. The first one would be a boycott. So that's a type of self-imposed commitment, can be by consumers or industry or banks to refrain from dealing in seabed minerals. Now, that's obviously a voluntary choice, so there's no real question about a legal basis here. The second one is also quite straightforward, which we called a political conditionality. And that would be essentially an individual state at the ISA committing themselves to not sponsoring seabed mining activities, right? So this would not be an ISA decision as such, but this would be, excuse me, my after hour lighting goes off very quickly. So political conditionality would be a self-imposed condition on a state to basically refrain from sponsoring seabed mining activities. Again, that's a political choice, so there's no real problem in terms of legal basis because, of course, UNCLOS doesn't force anyone to engage in mining. So the real, the more interesting ones, I suppose, is numbers 3 through to 6. So number 3 would be a de facto moratorium, which we would define as a bit of a broad acceptance by ISA member states to refrain from mining until certain conditions are met. So the conditions may be until there is more scientific clarity about the environmental harms, or until there is a sort of clear compliance regime to ensure that any rules and regulations can actually be enforced for seabed mining. But the important thing here to remember is that this does not require a formally adopted decision, right? It's a de facto moratorium, not a de jure moratorium, which is number 5. So we wanted to differentiate here. And you might even argue that a de facto moratorium is actually what we have at the moment. Because as Pradeep said in his introductory remarks, that the Council in the year 2023 confirmed that the Council member states do not wish to see any seabed mining without the adoption of the exploitation regulations, right? So in terms of legality here, again, there's no real legal difficulty because UNCLOS itself doesn't set a time frame for seabed mining, right? So there's no obligation to sort of move towards commercial scale exploitation within a certain time frame. This is just a delay, I suppose. This is not a permanent decision. Then number 4 is probably the one that is most often invoked by states. So most states have sort of come out in favor of a precautionary pause. So when I say most states, obviously of the states that are supporting a type of non-use measure. And a precautionary pause, I suppose, it's a sort of shared recognition amongst member states that additional time is needed to develop this mining code, right? So the focus here really is on the time element, the temporal element. And you know, that could be achieved through just a simple council decision, really, or, you know, a standing agenda item that can be reviewed every so often. And what's important, though, is that it doesn't determine what happens after a precautionary pause. So once the pause is lifted, that can lead to seabed mining or not, depending on what the evidence base is at the time and what decision states make. So it's pretty agnostic as to whether there will be seabed mining in the long term. So we would describe that as a form of freezing effect, right? It freezes the rights and obligations at present and just kind of takes them up again at a later point. Now, the legal basis for this, well, again, there is no time frame for seabed mining in the Law for Sea Convention. So that's the first thing to note. If this is a delay, then there is nothing inherently problematic with this measure. But I think a sort of more nuanced or more detailed answer would be to say, well, the main mandate of the ISA is to act on behalf of humankind as a whole in administering the mineral resources of the international seabed area. And Article 157 of UNCLOS, for example, focuses on the ISA's mandate to, and I quote, organize and control seabed mining, right? So in other words, what the ISA was created to do, or what UNCLOS highlights, is that the ISA is the forum that decides how to manage the minerals, right? As Jeff said, the minerals are the common heritage of humankind, and it's the ISA that decides how to manage those minerals. Now, at this point, maybe perhaps it might be useful to take a step back and sort of do a very brief recap of what are the historical reasons for why the ISA regime was established in the first place? Because that discussion occurred in the 1960s largely, so, you know, quite a while ago. And the discussion at the time wasn't so much about enabling or preventing seabed mining. The discussion was to ensure that, or to prevent a handful of wealthy states that would have the technology to mine first from reaping all the benefits, from essentially freely mining the seabed area, generating profits with that, and not having to share any of that. That was a concern from states in the 1960s, the main concern. There were others, but that was the sort of main one. And so there were a number of UN General Assembly resolutions in the late 1960s and the 1970s to declare the international seabed the common heritage of humankind, the implication being no one state can claim sovereignty over that area or over the minerals. And if anyone was to want to mine those minerals, you'd have to go through the ISA to seek permission. Now, at that point, the ISA wasn't established, so it was, you know, the talk was about a future institutional regime. But the idea was to avoid unilateral mining, right? So this hopefully tries to respond to, you know, one of the questions we've had in the chat there about the sort of object and purposes of the of UNCLOS. The idea was to make sure that any mining that it does occur, that benefits from that mining would be shared. Now, if we go back to that general mandate of the ISA to administer the mineral resources on behalf of humankind, that mandate, of course, must be carried out in accordance with the many conditions that are set out in Part 11 of the Law of the Sea Convention. There's quite a few conditions set out, including protecting historical objects, sharing of any benefits, the active participation of developing countries, and of course, the protection of the marine environment, right? So there's a number of conditions that the ISA needs to consider when deciding whether or not and under what conditions to allow mining. So all of these conditions are enshrined in UNCLOS and all of them are relevant. So you can argue that if these conditions currently cannot be met, then a pause or moratorium is in line with the Law of the Sea Convention. And in fact, there was in 2023, there was a legal opinion published by a group of London-based barristers that argued that if these conditions are not met, that a moratorium or a precautionary pause is not only consistent with UNCLOS, but indeed required by it. So you can even go further in the argument. But I think the point is that the ISA is the relevant institution to decide how to manage mining. And it's up to the ISA member states to really answer that question as to, how they wish to manage mining itself. So that's the sort of legal basis for a precautionary pause or a delay, or however you want to call it. Some form of temporary delay, I suppose, in mining. Then the fifth type of non-use measure would be what we call a de jure moratorium. So that would be a formally adopted decision by the ISA to delay mining. Now, there could be explicit conditions. It could be made explicit as to what the reasons are for the moratorium, which could also then, of course, link to explicit triggering of review of that decision, right? So as Jeff said earlier, how many of the reasons for a moratorium have to be met for states to no longer argue for a moratorium? So that could be set out, for example, in such a decision. There could also be a specified time frame. So we do at the moment have a moratorium on seabed mining in the Antarctic, and that moratorium has a 50-year time frame and then is up to review after that. So the legal basis here is the same as for a precautionary pause, because we are still talking about a temporary delay to ensure that all conditions in UNCLOS can be met. So it's not a definitive question as to whether to mine or not, but simply a decision to not mine at the moment. And then I suppose the last non-use measure is the most controversial one, and that's a ban of seabed mining. So I think here it's a little bit more difficult, but so an outright ban is, of course, has more of a permanent or indefinite character, and it seeks to prohibit seabed mining. Now, of course, that can still be overturned in the future if member states decide to revisit that decision, right? International law is based on state consent, and if states change their opinion, as long as they decide and agree on an opinion, then things can be changed. But in terms of legal basis, this is probably the most controversial one. So I think if we had detailed environmental baseline data and detailed sort of ideas as to what the exact environmental impacts would be, and all signs would point to seabed mining having serious environmental impacts, then you could probably argue that a ban is compatible with the Law of the Sea Convention, in particular Article 145, but also Part 12 on environmental protection. But because at the moment we operate in a context of a fair bit of uncertainty, I think it's less certain whether a ban, to what degree a ban can be justified. So hopefully that sort of gives a little bit of an idea as to what the different kinds of non-use measures are and what some of the legal bases for them will be. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aline, for walking us through those potential formulations, legal basis, and also some of the conditions attached to them. So very helpful. And also, thank you for addressing a question that was in the chat on whether it was consistent with the objective of UNCLOS. So I think you responded very skillfully to this. So thank you very much. You also mentioned one example in the Antarctica that was in your response. And so that's a very nice segue. And I suggest we move on to another section of the paper, which looks at past examples and potential pathways for those non-use measures. And so with this, maybe we can ask Pradeep to basically walk us through some previous moratoria examples that have been adopted And basically, if you could just illustrate some of the non-use measures that were implemented. So Pradeep, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clément, and I'll be quick. I think just to follow up on what Alina walked us through, it's not unusual for states to decide to implement non-use measures. It has been done before. It has been done quite frequently in other fora. I think Alina mentioned the Antarctic example. This was an instance where member states decided to impose a moratorium even before the activity actually commenced. So sort of the freezing effect of a moratorium that we explained in the paper, which is very much the idea, or at least how we see a pause at the ISA, which is essentially to press this pause button on the transition from exploration to exploitation. Since, as I mentioned in my opening, that there are no exploitation activities under the remit of the ISA as of yet. But we also have other examples, and I think a really good example that we also covered in the paper is on whaling. We do have a treaty from the 1940s that speak about whales as a resource and a resource that is there for exploitation. But since the 1980s, the International Whaling Commission has adopted a moratorium on whaling activities or commercial whaling activities. So it's another indication of states, and in this case, it's a reversing effect. And it's another indication of states or member states that belong to a particular treaty regime deciding which direction they want to take, when they want to take it. And it's always up to member states to decide which direction to go. I think a very interesting point that we covered in the paper, and not many people are aware of this, is that we actually do have some sort of a moratorium on seabed mining on the international seabed. And this was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1969 that essentially said, pending the establishment of a mechanism at the international level for deep seabed mining, there should not be any exploitation activities in the area. So that, some would even argue, myself included, that, that perhaps is still relevant today, since we don't really have the mining code in place. And as the council decided, commercial mining should not occur in the absence of regulations. I think that sort of consolidates that position as well already from 1969. Although that was a UN General Assembly resolution, which is non-binding. I just wanted to maybe end on this point that, by being member states, by being contracting parties to a treaty, states have obligations and responsibilities under international law that they are obliged to meet, and failure to meet such requirements could expose them to liability under international law. So that, I think, is a very important point, that states need to ensure that their responsibilities and their obligations that they've committed to under UNCLOS has been met before they allow seabed mining, if at all, to commence. And I think this was also sort of raised in one of the questions about other treaties as well that are also relevant. This newly adopted BBNJ agreement that is now, more and more states are starting to ratify, and hopefully the entry into force would come into soon. These are also obligations and responsibilities that states that are parties to both would need to ensure that they are being consistent. And for that, I'll refer you to another paper that I co-authored with Alina called Undermining by Mining with a question mark. And I'll put this link in the chat that you can take a look, where we argue that states cannot afford to be schizophrenic, to say one thing at one forum and something else at another forum. We need to ensure consistency on that. So just to end by saying that it has been done before, so it's not something unusual, and it's really up to member states how they want to live up to their responsibilities and obligations that they've committed to. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pradeep, for illustrating with the examples. I think super useful. And so with that, on the pathways to establish such measures, and so maybe having a little zoom on the ISA, what would be a possible pathway should ISA member states wish to adopt a precautionary proposal moratorium? So what would be the process?
Yeah, happy to take this also. I think one avenue that is currently on the table is to consider a general policy of the ISA. And for this, you have the assembly as the plenary body that is responsible for all other organs to perhaps take the lead in establishing such a general policy in collaboration with the council that could effectively lay down the conditions or the parameters that need to be met before mining activities can be allowed to commence. The council on its own could also take such measures, and again, reiterating that decision from July 2023, that commercial exploitation should not occur in the absence of regulations, is also a step in that direction. But there are provisions under UNCLOS that empower the council to close off areas if there's evidence of harm to the marine environment from mining activities. And so one obvious example could be mining for sulfides at hydrothermal vents, for instance. So that's something that can be pursued within the ISA, the Assembly and the Council. And I think finally also within the negotiations of the mining code, it's entirely up to states to decide the parameters, to decide the conditions of seabed mining, and even through the mining code can also sort of insert safeguards to ensure that no plan of work is approved until certain conditions and safeguards are met. Thanks.
Clement, can I just jump in there for a second? Just to build on what Pradeep just said, so the provision that I think he's referring to is Article 162, paragraph 2x. I'm going to assume that's what you mean, which I think is worth highlighting, that UNCLOS specifically provides for not allowing deep sea mining on environmental grounds, right? So this provision requires the council to disapprove areas for exploitation if there's a risk of serious harm to the marine environment. And so it has been argued by others, I think we sort of picked that up in the paper, that there is obviously a clear intention within UNCLOS to avoid serious harm. And if there is a risk of serious harm, to not allow seabed mining. Now, the idea is that that would probably be site specific, but of course, if best scientific knowledge at the moment indicates that the risk up to serious harm is actually not site specific at the moment, well, there's a question of whether the council can still use that provision to rely on to sort of justify a moratorium or precautionary pause of sorts. So there's a clear basis, I suppose, in the Law for Sea Convention to avoid serious environmental harm.
And maybe to add also that, you know, we have the 1994 agreement that also sort of inserts some safeguards, you know, what should be done by the authority before the first approval of a plan of work for exploitation. And we also covered this in the paper, that there is this anticipation that the ISA would be fit for purpose and develop regulations that are science-based in order to ensure that there is an effective and robust regime in place before it allows mining activities to commence. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Pradeep. And actually, one of the questions, as you mentioned, there's a few comments on the relevance of BBNJ, whether there's an overlap, and some questions on how do you see this being resolved, any potential overlaps and impacts. I guess you already covered this, and some of the findings will be in your paper, under Mining by Mining, which was pasted in the chat. I don't know if you want to add anything, or we can move on to the next question.
Just to add very briefly that the BBNJ agreement is certainly relevant to seabed mining. However, what we do need to always bear in mind, of course, is that UNCLOS confers exclusive jurisdiction on the ISA to regulate seabed mining. So while the BBNJ agreement is relevant in the sense that it may be difficult to achieve the objectives of the BBNJ agreement if seabed mining on a large scale, you know, with serious environmental harm is permitted at the moment. Maybe not in the future if there's other mining technology, of course, but at the moment, it would still have to be the ISA that decides on a moratorium. But of course, the provisions that we have in the BBNJ agreement is to obligate member states of the BBNJ agreement to promote the objects and purpose of the BBNJ agreement when they do their representations within the ISA and other bodies. So I think the effect of the BBNJ agreement will be somewhat indirect, delivered through the member states rather than directly. At least that's the sort of the channel that's foreseen in the treaty.
Thank you so much, Aline. Oh, Pradeep, and then Jeff, because I've seen.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe since we were talking about the undermining by mining paper, just to also chime in that while the ISA has exclusive jurisdiction over the mineral resources and access to them, it's not the only organization that has jurisdiction over environmental issues or the protection and preservation of the marine environment, including in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And so I think it's absolutely good to see other regimes like the Convention on Biological Diversity that has sort of weighed into the topic, expressing concern over seabed mining, including at the ISA occurring before the scientific evidence is there, or scientific knowledge is there, and before the ISA is fit for purpose to manage the environmental impacts of seabed mining. And also good to see other fisheries bodies, RFMOs, also expressing concerns over it, because of course, if seabed mining were to occur under the remit of the ISA, fisheries could be affected and so on. So I think it's right for all these other institutions, frameworks, and bodies that are operating in the area or close to the area or even beyond to sort of send messages as well as ensure that their representation at the ISA are, as Alina mentioned, fully aware of this, so that they could consolidate whatever position they want to take at the ISA, which ultimately is the body that decides whether, if, and how mining should happen. Thanks.
Thank you, Pradeep. Jeff, I see you've turned on camera.
Yeah. So the BB&J agreement is a very long time coming, almost 20 years. And one of the main reasons put forward by parties and others to have this agreement was that the current rules and regulations and international regime was very fragmented. And the ISA was one of those very important fragments, but it is not complete. And so there's this expectation that the BB&J Treaty, when it comes into force, will be a consolidating force. It will be a consolidation of the different perspectives that the fisheries management organizations included, seabed cables, shipping. They still have their own competencies. It is clear in the BB&J text that it shall not undermine those existing competencies. But it is hoped that it will provide a forum so that they can discuss the protection of biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction in a way that has not been discussed up until now. And a classic example was when the ISA issued an exploration permit in various places that have already been identified as ecologically or biologically sensitive areas, including the Lost City hydrogen field. So here's a place that was widely recognized by scientists as very important, should be preserved, and the ISA issued an exploration permit. So I think it's because they didn't know, or they did know and they didn't care, who knows. But the point is that having a forum where these concerns can be expressed and considered I think is quite important. And of course, the ISA and others are a little nervous about such a forum, but I think ultimately it is for the better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you, for chipping in and making these interlinkages with BB&J and other instruments. Still a lot to unpack, and when the treaty comes in force, there'll be a lot of those questions, how to implement it in practice. So very good to have those early food for thoughts. So thank you very much. Maybe going back to some of the discussions and to try and wrap up as we are nearing the end of this webinar. We mentioned, the ISA member states wishing to adopt this precautionary pause, but maybe one question would be like, could this moratorium be established outside of the ISA? So we already had some elements of responses from you, but if any of you want to mention whether that's possible or not.
Well, just very quickly, I think my answer would be, as I sort of indicated, that it's really good for impulses to come outside the ISA. Let's take the example of whaling, for instance. So the moratorium was really not adopted at the Whaling Commission, as a first step. There were actually many steps before that, including the adoption at the UN General Assembly, a moratorium on whaling that eventually all fed into the International Whaling Commission, and the member states there then decided to adopt a moratorium on whaling. And so I would say the same applies here, that, I think efforts and calls for a moratorium can come from outside the ISA as well as within the ISA, and then ultimately resulting at the ISA a decision of the member states.
Thank you very much, Pradeep, for this. There was one quick question maybe that we can take on if the exploitation contracts subject to the EIAs and ecological impact at the ISA, whether those findings and data gathered by the exploratory are shared internationally. So who has access to those data? So going back to the access point. So we can, yeah, Jeff, I see your hand.
Yeah, this is a real sore point among the scientific community. So there's been, at long last, there was a database set up by the ISA called the Deep Data Database. But companies are not required to share all their data with this database. They're allowed to, some of the most important data in our minds, including the mineral deposits, are viewed as commercially sensitive. Now, if you pause and think about this, it makes no sense at all because they already have an exclusive contract to the area. No one else can come into this area to mine. So why would those mineral data be confidential? But they are. Any other data that are they're physical, biological, or sometimes they have not been collected harmoniously the same way. They're sort of by the by, and the historical data were very poor. There is a paper out that talks about the use of the deep database, how many duplicate records there were, how much they had to clean the data, how difficult it was to use the data. It's by Muriel Rabon et al. And she got a lot of newspaper coverage. The Guardian covered it. Full disclosure, I was a reviewer of that paper. And it shows that this database is by no means fit for purpose. The ISA responded very strongly against the paper, claiming it was not true, and there was a back and forth. But honestly, I've tried to get into the data. I went and tried to access data that I already had. Okay, so I had data from the researchers, and I went and tried to find those same data in the deep data database, and I couldn't find them. Like I knew they were there, but I could not find them. So it is a very difficult database to use. Also, researchers have limited access. Contractors have privileged access. They get full access. So there's a lot of issues around this database. The ISA will say, yes, it's being shared, but the actual reality is more complicated and nuanced than that.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I think yes, a lot to unpack there as well on access of data. So thank you. Maybe one last questions. Thank you so much, all of you, for being patient and staying with us. But we think it's a great question. Why is there no difference made between the polymetallic nodules and the other forms of mining? So if any of you can cover this, Aline?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. There certainly could be a moratorium that's specific to particular types of mineral deposits. There is nothing stopping the ISA from doing that. And I think it depends on what the reasons are for a moratorium, right? So if the reasons are around a lack of scientific understanding as to the environmental impacts, well, that should probably be resource specific. If, however, the reason for a moratorium is more around enforcing and monitoring technology of the ISA and a sort of lack of ability to enforce the legal framework, then that would apply across the board of different mineral types. So it depends a little bit on what states see as the most important reason for a moratorium, if indeed that they decide to adopt one. So I think it sort of depends on that. But thank you for asking that question. That's a good point.
Thank you for jumping in, Aline. Any other point from Pradeep or Jeff? Or I think that was already very clear. So thank you very much.
I just want to add that there's a difference between a scientific rationale that Aline may have been hinting at and political reality. Politically, I think it's quite unlikely that there would be a moratorium for just one metal type, one mineral type, even if scientifically you say, oh yeah, well, we're not so worried about this or that. So my hunch, and it's just a hunch, is that it's an all or nothing package, that it's not going to break down by mineral type, even if there are sound scientific reasons for doing so. I think just politically at the ISA itself, it's going to be an all or nothing package.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And there's a comment in the chat that whether you could share the publication that you mentioned. So yeah, we can do an email after the event to share the recording and also the resources mentioned. So Just wanted to wrap up. Thank you very much, everybody, for staying with us. It's been a very insightful discussions, and I'd like to thank you, the audience, for staying, but also the experts who have provided a great overview of their paper and going beyond on providing their thoughts and also thinking about the future, what it could look like. So thank you very much. We'll make the recording available, and we hope to see some of you next week at the IUCN negotiations as they resume. The IUCN Secretariat will be there in the person of Pradeep, so it'd be great if you could reach out to him. Don't hesitate. And otherwise, we'll thank you and wishing you a nice rest of your day/week. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.